Hello and welcome to the Socialist World podcast from the Committee for a Workers' International, putting forward a Marxist analysis and revolutionary socialist program to harm the struggle against capitalism.
Hello and welcome to Socialist World, the podcast. My name's Sean Figg from the Committee for a Workers' International's International Secretariat. Today on the podcast, Iran and the protest movement that we've seen there over the past month. I'm joined by Bob Labi from the CWI's International Secretariat. Good afternoon, Bob.
Hi.
And let's get straight into it. The year has begun in a very dramatic style. On the last episode, we were discussing with Tony Sormois about the events in Venezuela. But on the other side of the world, over the last month, there's been a massive protest movement in Iran. From the footage we've seen on the TV, it appears to have reached almost insurrectionary levels in some cities. We seem to have gone into a quiet period now. That's unlikely to be the end of the movement. Why did the protest movement erupt, and where are we now with it?
I think in looking at anything like this, we've got to look at the immediate and the longer term causes. This last protest movement was sparked off by a sudden drop in the value of the Iranian currency, which provoked a crisis for some of the traders in the bazaar in Tehran.
Which historically have been an important base of support for the regime, I think.
They were, and it has been, but it wasn't just the owners of the shops in the bazaar, but also the workers in those shops were involved, because the crisis which is gripping Iran threatened their livelihoods. And they, by going out to publicly protest against the effects of the collapse of the currency, and also the budget, which had been announced just a few days before, sparked off this movement. But at the same time, it's not the first time that there's been such a movement. Coincidentally, this last movement started 8 years to the day from when, in 2017, there'd been a similar movement had developed in response to an increase in fuel prices. And that movement was if you like, initially a wider movement which took place. But what was different this time was that while in some places the demonstrations weren't that big, they had a far greater coverage, a far greater spread across the whole of the country.
So not just in the capital, but other smaller towns, regional cities?
Exactly. And they involved sometimes just a few hundred in some of the cities, but they started to develop a certain momentum. Now, because it was the traders who started this movement, there was a certain suspicion towards them, precisely because they'd been seen as supporters of the regime in the past. But then after a few days, other sectors started to come in. The students started to come in, and also there were beginning of protests involving wider parts of the population. And it started to develop a momentum. And the regime was clearly worried about that. Initially, they tried to say, we understand why you're angry. We understand that. We can wait, we'll deal with it. But that didn't stop the momentum developing. And given the weakness of the regime, they decided to go in very hard and very brutally.
I mean, maybe that we could pick up on that point, that before looking more at the protests, is the weakness of the regime. Why would we describe it as particularly weak at this point in time?
I think the weakness is reflected in a number of different sides to it. Externally, the regime has been weakened in the past few years by the fact that the offensive, led really by the US and Israel, has, if you like, weakened the regional position of Iran. You've had, obviously, as a result of the Israeli offensive in Gaza, not simply the death of over 70,000 people, a horrendous total, but also a dramatic weakening of Hamas. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has been weakened by Israeli action. And then, of course, there was
And both of which are supported and funded up to a point by the Iranian regime, right?
Yes, and at the same time, we had last June the brief war when the Israeli regime started attacking Iran, and then the US joined in at the end of that offensive. And all of that has weakened both the international position of the regime and also it's revealed its own weakness to its own population. Now, at the same time, there has been a growing, if you like, opposition to the regime inside the country. And that's been reflected in different ways. If you look, for instance, at the last presidential election in 2024, less than 40% of the population voted in the first round of that election, which showed the sort of, if you like, weakness of support for the regime. And even amongst those who voted, a large number spoiled their ballot papers. In other words, to indicate opposition or to indicate that they didn't support any of the candidates, because it was an election, but the regime itself determines who is allowed to stand.
I was going to ask about that because in general, people would view the Iranian regime as dictatorial, yet they allow elections.
Yes, within certain limits, and they allow some of the debates which go on among the ruling elite and within the regime. They allow these debates to a certain extent to be reflected in elections where you have candidates who represent different trends within the elite, and also sometimes even in the media as well. But it's all strictly controlled. It's within limits. And that is why often in these elections, while there are rivals fighting in the election, large sections of the population don't see them as really offering anything different. And that's the sort of basis, on one hand, why the regime is weak, but also, especially in the last 8 years or so, since the fuel protests, which began at the end of 2017, there has been a series of movements, protests against the regime, and also a development in a number of workplaces of trade unions, sometimes semi-legal unions, which have engaged in struggles. Now, the regime has sometimes, given a certain amount of concessions, but also has used repression. Now, in the last few weeks, it's not exactly clear how many people died. Recently, somebody from the regime told a news agency that about 5,000 people had died and about 20,000 or so have been arrested at the present time. Horrendous figures. But it's not the only time when there's been repression in recent period in Iran. In November 2018, there was a series of protests again on the question of fuel prices when about 2,000 people were killed in those protests. And in fact, that month is now referred to as Bloody November. But it's not simply been the protests on the economic issues.
And I would add the bloodletting that the regime unleashes when protests take place. It really underlines the bravery and the desperation of people in Iran, the working class, young people and so on, that they still take to the streets knowing the likely reaction of the regime.
Absolutely. And that indicates the fervour of the regime. But also, in a way, it reflects the desperation of the regime because they're scared of movements developing momentum. And that was really seen in the huge movement in 22-23, the so-called Women Life Freedom Movement, against not just the oppression of women in Iran, but also against the whole, if you like, grip of the regime of stifling not just the women, but stifling the youth, stifling the country itself. And those demonstrations were huge, far bigger than we've seen recently. And because of that, in a way, the regime itself didn't immediately go to crush the movement because there was such a scale to it. And what they waited for was the protest, if you like, almost to run out of steam, to exhaust themselves. And so the regime has had different tactics, but while they've had these different tactics, what they've been dealing with is a position of potential weakness. But I would say just one other thing as well, and that is the regime does have a core of support.
Okay.
It does have a certain basis. It's not a majority, but it has a basis.
Amongst which sections?
I would say it's amongst those who are either, for one reason or another, supportive of the regime. You know, whether it be from the point of view of those who profit from the regime, those who, because of the way in which the regime presents itself, you know, as a religious-based regime, those who, out of their own beliefs, support the regime.
And there's been huge sacrifices for the regime in living memory, in the Iran-Iraq war, for example.
Well, precisely. And we should remember that the attack of Iraq against Iran was sponsored by the West. Remember that Saddam Hussein, at that stage, was being supported by the West in the attack on Iran. Both the US and Britain, even in Britain, the government was secretly arranging for companies to supply weapons equipment to Iraq. They kept it secret, but nevertheless, that is what they were actually doing. And from Saddam Hussein's point of view, he thought that the West were supporting them, which gave rise to the invasion of Kuwait, because he thought the West would back him doing it, and then found that the West didn't support him, which was the beginning of his end. But that's another...
And that was in the early 90s. And the irony is that he's gone now and the Iranian regime is still there.
That's very true, yes. It is there. But precisely because of the attack in the Iran-Iraq war, which was a horrendous war of 8 years or so, with hundreds of thousands of people killed in that war, and also the continual attacks on Iran, you know, the use of, whether it be like we saw in the middle of last year, the bombing attacks of Israel and the US, the fact that the sanctions which have been imposed on Iran, which have had a crippling effect on the Iranian economy.
Chiefly under the auspices of US imperialism, right?
Yes, but also at the end of last year, France, Germany, and Britain also pushed, and they got through the United Nations, a reimposition of sanctions to further weaken the regime. Obviously, this is in the context of the whole question of the campaign against what the West see as Iran preparing to acquire nuclear weapons, something which the Iranian regime rejects, and which the atomic inspectors have not really proved, not really seen that they're actually stepping towards immediately towards gathering nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, the West is worried. The Western powers are worried, but that they're building up the possibility, the capability at some point of developing nuclear weapons, which would change the balance, obviously, in the Middle East.
And part of the current balance, of course, is that Israel actually has nuclear weapons.
Well, Israel has nuclear weapons which they've never actually denied. But it's also that some of the Iranian enemies have got nuclear weapons. It's well known that the Saudi regime partly financed Pakistan in developing its nuclear weapons, and the assumption is that there's some kind of deal between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, that if Saudi Arabia needs nuclear weapons, they'll get them from Pakistan. Now, that's, if you like, part of the underlying conflict. But at the same time, what's also noticeable this time is that when, for his own reasons, Trump started threatening Iran that if demonstrators were killed, that he would intervene, countries neighboring neighboring Iran, like Saudi Arabia and like the UAE, and in fact even Israel, warned against attacking now, felt that it could inflame the situation because there is such great hostility in Iran towards the threat of outside intervention. And so in this situation, if you like, to come back to something you asked a bit earlier, the regime has got a certain basis of support, not just those who profit from the regime, not just for those who support the regime for religious reasons, but also for those who still see the regime as fighting against foreign intervention.
Against imperialism.
Exactly, because there's been the intervention through the 20th century, the history of Iran. And that has led to a great, if you like, fear and anger against foreign intervention.
Okay, so the regime's got a certain basis of support. We've looked into that. There's the question of the alternative of what could possibly replace the regime in the future, how that could be achieved. Now, obviously, that's a question where different class forces on the world stage have got completely different views. One of the things that came up during the protest movement was the resurfacing of the son of the deposed Shah of Iran. So how do the imperialist powers see the future of Iran?
Well, I think that it is clear that sooner or later there'll either be the collapse of the regime or there'll be big splits opening up inside the regime. They cannot continue indefinitely. And when that happens, there's going to be the major battle as to what should be the future. And in that, the different world powers, are, if you like, looking to how could that unfold. And if you look in the recent period, there is no doubt that there's been this attempt to really build up the son of the last Shah, to build up the idea of the monarchy. And if you look at what some of the Western powers are doing, they are hedging their bets. They've got a number of alternatives. Trump himself, and Trump isn't always wrong, Trump himself said he doubts how much support the son of the former Shah has really got in Iran. And on that, he's probably right. It's an open question. So you've got this situation where, for instance, if you look at some of the Western media, there are programs after programs on the son of the last Shah, trying to put him forward as somebody who could help Iran. Somebody he sometimes says that he would help to organize the democracy, even though there was no such democracy when his father ruled. But they have a certain arrogance. If you look at some of the material which they produced in the recent period, even before this recent the last protest, the son of the next Shah is described as the leader of the opposition. Well, who proclaimed that? It's his friends sitting in the US and other places. They proclaim him like the leader and then hope that because he's proclaimed as the leader, he will become the leader of the opposition. And we see this in the propaganda, by many of the Western media concerns. If you look, for instance, at the BBC, who have a Persian service at the BBC, they keep stressing about the Shah. They interview him and they interview his entourage, his people around him. There was even at one stage during these protests where the BBC ran an interview with an Iranian exile who'd left Iran at the similar age to the ex-Shah when he left in 1979, who spent a large part of his interview saying how wonderful the former Queen of Iran was towards him and how she looked after him, which has got nothing to do with anything which is going on in Iran today, except to say, aren't these nice people? Ignoring that the Shah's regime was absolutely brutal, had one of the worst, most brutal secret services, SAVAK, which operated in Iran, and trying to dress it up. Now,
and it was, of course, it was in the overthrow. It was the masses who overthrew the Shah's regime and lifted up the current Islamic Republic.
Precisely. And it's also remembered that the Shah's regime was sponsored by Western powers.
So it doesn't help that his son lives in the US at the moment. Is that right?
No, but it's also the whole thing. I mean, his grandfather was an army leader who led a coup in the early 1920s in Iran. And then in 1925, with Western backing, mainly Britain, backing, declared himself king. Then in the early 1950s, you had a nationalist movement in Iran under Mossadegh, who became prime minister of the country, who moved to nationalize the oil industry, something which was beginning to become talked about in different countries, that they should control their own resources. It wasn't a movement towards socialism or breaking with capitalism, but it was to establish Iranian control over the oil industry. This angered British and US imperialism, so they staged a coup in 1953 to overthrow the Mossadegh government and bring the Shah, who'd had been forced into exile, back into his rule. So even the rule of the present claimant to the throne's father was only ensured in 1953 by British-American intervention, and that is remembered by Alea. But at the same time, there are those who actually have illusions in the Shah, or the idea of bringing back the monarchy, and that is something which is, if you like, something which the Western powers are attempting to build upon in order to, if you like, strengthen that as a means of controlling the mass movement. That's their aim. Now, at the same time, it's led to a polarization where there is the beginning now of a polarization in the opposition between what are called the monarchists and the Republicans. But that raises the question not just of defeating the monarchists, it also raises the question of what type of republic should be formed. And that is the key question, because it even was the case in 1979, when you had the overthrow of the Shah and the beginning of the construction of what was called the Islamic Republic of Iran, that for many people in Iran, for significant sections, what they hoped the Islamic Republic would be a republic of the poor, a republic of the honest against the corrupt. Those were the sort of hopes of a section, at least powerful sections, which supported the movement in '79. But that wasn't what it turned out to be. It wasn't that sort of free, liberated republic, so to speak. And in this situation, the question of, yes, defeat the monarchists, that's understandable, because who do they really represent? But then the question is, what type of republic? And that's going to be one of the major lines of debate.
And that's one of the most, that is the most important question for us. I mean, what you've described there, it shows how the class divisions in Iranian society, the class aspirations as well, for the working class, the poor, for a better future, a better life, control over their lives, was given a distorted reflection initially in the Islamic Republic. Hopes have been destroyed, dashed as the generations have passed now. So in many ways, the lessons for the future of the struggles of the poor and the working class, the youth in Iran, there are lessons there to be drawn out. Because if that question of the class foundations of the regime isn't addressed in future movements with a clear idea of the class foundations of a new republic, if you like, then the same problems will eventually come back. So what do we see as the way forward?
I think we have to, I'll just make another point, I think we also have to see that the question of freedom is such an important issue in such a dictatorial regime. We mentioned before about the Iran-Iraq war, and the Islamic regime used the Iran-Iraq war to carry out, in a way, a one-sided civil war inside Iran against the left. Even some of the left who mistakenly, completely wrongly collaborated with the Islamic regime because they felt this was how to defend the revolution against the attack led by, at that stage, Iraq. There was a one-sided civil war with thousands upon thousands being executed, others being imprisoned. And around Khomeini, the religious leadership consolidated their control during the Iran-Iraq war under the slogan of defending the revolution from the attack. And they used that all the time. That's why their own militia are still called the Revolutionary Guards. It's how, if you like, they try and use the tradition that there had been a popular movement as a justification for their rule and the justification for crushing opposition. And that's what they say sometimes even today. The oppositionists are called counter-revolutionaries. In that sense, they try and use that spirit when in fact the result of what has come out has been opposite to what the people actually wanted.
Making that point, I'm reminded of a similar phenomenon in a number of the southern African countries where the former liberation movements or liberation guerrilla armies ended up forming the government and still today, with complete hypocrisy, no credibility, continue to claim to stand in the legacy of those movements that had at one stage of popularity. Obviously, we think that the question of the regime and the question of capitalism in Iran and the region and the world indeed are linked. Before we come to that point, maybe you could just say a few words about what we know. So what we know has limits, but the civil war that the regime waged against the left that you've mentioned, presumably that was against left and or socialist parties, against trade unions. What forces exist on the ground that we could point to, as far as we know, that we could point to, that could play a role in putting forward a more comprehensive program, a socialist program, to replace the regime?
I think if you look at the period, of the development of the revolutions in 78, 79, you could see that within the left there was a clear sort of division. There was a sector led by what was then the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, which believed in collaboration with the emerging Islamic regime on the basis of seeing that as a stage towards a further liberation somewhere down the line. And that was all, and that was, if you like, something which we've seen in other revolutions. And the effect of that was, if you like, prevent the development of a truly independent movement, which would fight for the interests of the working class and in fact hold the working class back in the interest of maintaining the unity with the emerging Islamic Republic regime. And for a time, the Tudeh Party was tolerated, and then when the Islamic leadership moved to consolidate their regime, the Tudeh Party suffered enormously, along with others as well.
So they paid the price for their mistaken policy.
Well, they paid the price, but also the whole Iranian working class paid the price, if you like, in that sense. There were others who opposed that policy, but didn't have a clear direction what they could actually do. And certainly it was a difficult situation because the regime did have a popular support. So in the sense of having a debate and arguing for a position, it was a question of taking up democratic issues and social issues. Like, for instance, fairly soon, the regime, moved to, in the early days of 79, moved to consolidate its position. Like, for instance, it wrote its own a new constitution, and then said very nicely that the people can decide, but only in a referendum. That's not a discussion about a constitution. You either vote yes or no in a referendum. There's no choice. And because they presented this as the new revolutionary constitution, yes, they got a majority, but it was a completely undemocratic maneuver because they didn't want people themselves to discuss what they would like in the constitution. At the same time, they began to move against women, to establish the controls over women, from whether it be what women wore and other restrictions on women were gradually introduced, which led to protests. There were quite significant protests. But the question was, how that can be developed, what should be done. And as I said before, it was made far more difficult by the attack of Iraq, because that enabled the Islamic leadership, as I said before, to keep saying we're defending the revolution. And so it was a very difficult position. But that was a long time ago. It was a long time ago now. And if we've seen, especially, if you like, in this century, a growth of new forms of opposition, a growth, if you like, there has been growth of opposition, not just to the regime, but also discussions which are taking place about what should be done, what should we do now, what's the alternative. And these discussions take place. There's a lot of repression which still goes on. Some of the discussion takes place on in internet chat rooms and things like that, which give a certain amount of freedom to discuss, but it is limited, obviously, because the regime tries to control it. And like now, there's talk that they may reconstruct the internet in Iran to only allow the internet to function within Iran itself and limit the links outside Iran in that way to try and control what is actually being discussed, a stronger grip on what is going on. A bit like what the Chinese regime attempts to do with the internet in China. So there are discussions going on, but one of the key things now is to look again at the lessons of what has happened in the recent period.
So distill down for us, Bob, what are those lessons and what is the way forward?
Well, I think there are a number of questions which come up. Obviously, in the situation where there's quite a deep economic crisis at the present time, where if you look, for instance, last year, it was general inflation was 40% inflation. Food prices went up by 70% last year. I mean, yes, in the budget, which the regime announced at the end of last year, they talked about a 20% wage increase. Sounds a lot, except when you realize that food prices have gone up 70% and general prices 40%. And it's interesting that while in the recent period, we've seen the repression increasing, since in the last few days in Iran. At the same time, it seems that, for example, the regime has offered a special financial compensation to the teachers. And the reason why it's interesting is that the teachers are one of the sectors of workers who have some kind of national movement, shall we say. What there are committees which link together the teachers' unions and teachers' bodies in different parts of the country and attempt to coordinate themselves nationally, which is significant. They're the one section of workers which really do that at the present time. The others, unions, tend to be based around individual companies or sectors, in different parts of the country. But it's interesting that the regime feels that they had to give some financial offer to the teachers, from the point of view of trying, in this sense, to ameliorate, to lessen the pressure for action.
And the potential for them to be a frame for opposition, national frame for opposition.
Exactly. And in that situation, the economic issues, but also especially as the issues of freedom, not just free speech, but freedom to live, the whole question of the position of women in Iran, but also the position of the national minorities, because in Iran is one of the countries where you've got a large number of different nationalities within it, significant minorities, whether it be the Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, and others as well. And so the whole question of freedom in the wider sense is a very important question, alongside with the issue of how to deal with the economic crisis. There's a big environmental crisis. Like in a number of other parts of the world, there's a severe environmental crisis developing in Iran, especially on the question of water, where there are water shortages, partly because of drought and partly because of weak infrastructure in Tehran. Tehran, the city itself, is about 9-10 million people live in Tehran. There's water shortages there. And just before the recent protests, the Iranian president was raising the question about whether they should construct a new city, a new capital of Iran on the coast, reflecting the crisis which is developing. So all these things need to be dealt with in a program. But then there also is the question of what to do about the regime. And what needs to be done is to work out is to understand a strategy to deal with the regime. And we saw that very clearly posed again in the recent protests.
And what could that involve?
I think there's a number of different aspects to it. The first thing is organization on the ground, of gathering together people, whether it be in workplaces, in communities, but gathering together people to organize themselves, to discuss what they can do, to even do things like, how do you organize protests? How do you defend those people who are being attacked in the protests, etc.? In that basic form of organization. There are, as I said before, a number of independent unions or semi-independent unions which exist at the present time. And they generally often make statements in support of the demands of the protesters, but they don't say anything what should be done. And I think there's probably a fear that they're semi-legal, they do suffer repression, and they feel that if they said, like, go on strike or go on protest to support this movement, they would then feel the full weight of the regime's repression. That is the real situation. So there's got to be a way in which the movements can be organized from below, but then also need to have a strategy. In the recent movement, it was quite widely discussed there needs to be a general strike. Even the son of the ex-king said at one moment, I heard this interview where he called on workers to organize a general strike. Mm-hmm. It was a wide call. But there was no serious discussion how to develop a general strike. What demand should it be on? You need a program of demands. What should it be on?
What's it calling for?
Exactly. And how should it organized? Should it immediately be an unlimited general strike? Or should it be, first of all, say, for a general strike of 2 days in order to mobilize the forces and then see that not as an end in itself, not as a safety valve, as you sometimes see general strikes called in different countries, where union leaders call a general strike to let workers let off steam and then do nothing. So they just have a general strike and then the workers can go home. No, but the idea of having, if it was a 48-hour general strike, for example, as a stepping stone towards further movements. Would you call for mass demonstrations? It's significant that many of the demonstrations took place at night. It's not clear exactly why. Was it because of fear of surveillance cameras? Like in a number of other countries now, the Iranian regime is heavily invested in surveillance cameras all the way through at least the major cities, and then using them to pick people up, using visual recognition technologies to pick up who people are, etc. So there's all sorts of issues which need to be discussed. And then alongside that comes the question of what should be the alternative.
As in the alternative if the regime is brought down?
Yes, and that is a key question.
Okay, you've mentioned the programme that's necessary. What would be necessary to implement that programme, though?
The challenge we have is to build support for this programme, to win popular support for such a programme, and then also to see what needs to be done concretely to actually be able to implement it. And for that, you need a force which is able to both campaign for a programme, but also to learn from the struggles which take place. It's not an issue of just imposing a programme on a movement. It's a question of winning support and developing the programme, learning from the experience of struggle, like the experience of what's just happened now. And to do that, you need a party, a genuine party, not a party of careerists, but a revolutionary party which has got members who are prepared to fight for these ideas, but also to have a dialogue with wider sections of the population to win support for these ideas and the practical steps which need to be taken to implement them. Because, as I said before, there'll be a struggle to control the movement, not simply from the monarchists, but also from those who describe themselves as Republicans, but are pro-capitalist Republicans. There is no doubt that inside the capitalist class in Iran, they've got different views towards the Islamic Republic. There'll be a section who would like to get rid of the Islamic king and have a more, shall we say, normal capitalist country. Now, they may offer, if you like, democratic rights at the present time, but the pro-capitalists will not have an answer to the problems facing the mass of the Iranian people at the present time.
The question of living standards.
Living standards, even how to secure the democratic rights. Because we can see in revolutions where democratic rights are won and then they're gradually taken away. Look what happened in Egypt after the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. Mubarak was overthrown. There was a period of relative freedom in Egypt. But now we've seen, over the years, a development of counter-revolution. And the current regime of Sisi is more repressive than Mubarak's regime was. And the similar thing could happen in Iran. It wouldn't necessarily be a religious bodies coming back, but it could be an equally repressive regime led by Republicans.
And that's linked to this question that where capitalism is weaker, the basis for democracy is shallower as well, meaning the regimes to contain the class struggle rely on repression to a greater extent. Whether it's religious coloration, military, police, and so on, it's a feature of the diseased nature of capitalism in these countries. Absolutely.
And so, therefore, the question is, what should be the way forward? Now, some of the groups in Iran, which are functioning on the ground, they do raise the question of socialism. But it's unclear what they actually mean by that. Do they mean it should be an immediate term objective to end the capitalist system and to begin, if you like, the construction of socialism? Or do they think it's something which is in the long term? And that is a vital question.
This idea of stages you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And in that situation, the question of what is the strategy of the left, that is such a key one. And what we try and do is we try and argue to look at the lessons of a once successful revolution in Russia in 1917, where you saw a mass movement which overthrew the dictatorship of the Russian emperor, the Tsar, which then saw a massive self-organization of not just the working class, but of peasants as well, the huge military, because it was during the First World War. You saw all these ingredients come into play, if you like. The question was, how could that movement be developed? How could, if you like, it could develop into a movement which broke the power of capitalism? And in that movement in 1917, the revolutionaries, the serious revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, argued against participating in any pro-capitalist formation. and instead argued that what was needed was a change in society, a change in the fundamentals of society, a breaking with capitalism, if the immediate issues which the people faced were going to start to be resolved. And in that sense, rejecting the idea of, if you like, participating with pro-capitalists in trying to stabilize, shall we say, the situation. Because even if one is a socialist and you join a pro-capitalist government, that means you're running capitalism, running the existing system. And that is what has got to be rejected. Now, that doesn't mean that if in such a situation there is an attempt to turn the clock back, an attempt at counter-revolution, you may fight alongside pro-capitalists to defeat that counter-revolution. That happened in 1917 in Russia, in August 1917. But that didn't mean joining in that moment of crisis the pro-capitalist government in order to defeat counter-revolution. It didn't mean that. That's, for instance, what happened in Spain in 1936 when Franco led his rebellion against the civilian Popular Front government. The left rallied, said let's all form a government together to defeat the counter-revolution. But that was the wrong way to go about it, because by doing that, you hold back the real fight against the counter-revolution, which isn't simply just beating them back once, but removing the roots of the counter-revolution, which is the capitalist system itself. So that is what we need to argue, because the danger is that when you get a big movement, there'll be an attempt to draw the left into let's all work together as Democrats, etc., etc. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't collaborate with other forces on an immediate issue, but it's different from forming an alliance or forming a government with them. And instead arguing that what is needed is a government which represents the working class and the poor in a country like that. That is what is actually needed. And that is something that we try and stress, but also we try and link that internationally. One of the reasons why the Saudis and the UAE, and other leaders in the region warned Trump against militarily intervening in Iran, because they feared their own population. They feared that a movement in Iran, a movement for democracy in Iran, would have a big effect. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia. They don't even pretend to have votes on anything. Iran gets denounced, for the number of executions which take place in that country. It was maybe about 1,000 last year. Well, Saudi Arabia isn't that far behind. It was 360 executions last year in Saudi Arabia for all sorts of offences. Leave aside the people who are just held in prison as political prisoners in Saudi Arabia. A movement in Iran for liberation and that could have an immediate effect in Saudi Arabia, even if the Saudis at this minute have a more comfortable economic position than Iran does.
And the possibility for revolutionary movements, mass movements to spread quickly, we've already seen in the recent history in the Arab Spring.
Yes, but also it could be as well with a more clearer strategy what needs to be done, saying, follow us, this is what the steps which need to be done. In a situation of crisis, that can really develop, a wider movements. And we saw that in a certain way after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when there were attempts in different countries to follow the example of what had actually happened. And so we argue as well, not just for what we would say is a clear policy inside Iran, but also an international view. Because you cannot break from capitalism just in one country, as long as capitalism dominates the world economy. That domination will cripple any attempt to break with capitalism in one country. And therefore the question is how to expand the movement, to say to others, follow the example. And that's the important thing as well in a movement in Iran or anywhere else. It's how a successful movement in one country can have that international effect.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Bob. I think we'll have to leave it there. There's a huge more, of course, we could discuss and we can discuss in future episodes. So the CWI, if I can summarise what you've just said, we fight against the policy of class collaboration in the movement for the independence of socialist and working class organisations. I think the phrase "no mixing up of the banners" has been something that the Marxist movement has put forward in the past. And of course, an organisation to embody that programme, a party, is crucial. And of course, that's the day-to-day business of the CWI, building the organised forces of Marxism in different countries and linking them up around the world. We're sure that the discussions that you've outlined are taking place could lead to discussions, to engagement with young people, with workers on the ground in Iran. And the CWI itself is looking to build support in Iran to link up with our forces in the region and internationally. And maybe we can end by saying that anyone that listens to this episode and is interested to get in touch with the CWI, the details are in the box below. We have a new article on the CWI website looking at the questions we've examined today that we'd recommend people look at. And thank you today for listening.
The Committee for Workers International is organized on every continent. If you would like to join us and get active building the CWI in your part of the world, please visit our website at socialistworld.net. Here you can also subscribe to our weekly email newsletter and support our work by making a donation. If you have any questions or comments about that podcast, please let us know and we may try and respond in future episodes.